when we name ionic compounds, it turns out that a lot of the time, the pain that comes from naming the compound actually comes from naming the anion. So that's why I'm here to hopefully kind of help fix that by telling you about naming monoatomic anions. So things like Cl minus and F minus and O2 minus and let's see here, N3 minus, things like that. So actually naming monoatomic anions isn't really that hard. You basically, what you do is you just take the element name. So for our first case, we just take our element name, so chlorine, and wipe off any existing endings. Or if you want to think about it differently, take the stem of the element name, right? Whichever one you want to think about, and add an "ide" at the end. So we basically what we do is we wipe off the ending and just replace it with an "ide." So chlorine for Cl minus becomes chloride. Right? If you want to think about like adding "ide" to the stem, our stem is chlor, and then just add an "ide," so it becomes chloride, right? So for our F minus, we initially have fluorine. Wipe off the ending, wipe off the existing ending, or take the stem and just add an "ide," so you get fluoride. If I can spell fluoride, I think this is right. Fluoride. Let's see here. For O2 minus, we initially have oxygen. Now the ending here is a little different. Like, well, the ending that already exists in the name oxygen is kind of different. It's actually this entire egen part. So you wipe that off and you just add an "ide" at the end. So you get oxide. Other way to think about it is that you have the stem of oxygen, so ox, and you just add an "ide" at the end, so you get oxide. Same thing for nitrogen. Well, same thing for the element name nitrogen. So we start off with nitrogen. And same way we wiped off the egen, we wipe off the ogen and add an "ide," so it becomes nitride. Right? So this is usually a general rule, but as with most things in chemistry, the rule is like broken half the time. So there are also crazy exceptions, like S2 minus. We normally would write sulfur. So the ending we take off it isn't apparent from the element name that we have an actual ending, but it turns out the UR, the part is an ending, is the ending that we wipe off. And so we take the sulf part and add an "ide," so it becomes sulfide. And same way for phosphorus. Well, same way for the P3 minus ion. We would normally have phosphorus. That's a long name. And the ending isn't really entirely clear, and the stem really isn't entirely clear either, but it turns out phosp is the stem. So we wipe off the orus and we replace it with an "ide," so we have phosphide. So the overall rule is all monoatomic anions end with "ide," but where exactly to place the "ide kind of becomes, it's kind of riddled with exceptions. So usually, most of the time, at least for the halogens, you have an ending that you can wipe off, like the enes, and replace with an "ide." For other elements like oxygen, nitrogen, you can replace the egen or ogen with an "ide to get oxide, nitride. And there's some crazy elements like sulfur and phosphorus. You just kind of have to remember the anion name, like for S2 minus and P3 minus. So ideally, you can kind of guess that sulfuride. Have you heard of that before? I don't think so, right? Same way, like sulfide, like you probably haven't heard of that. So sulfide probably makes the most sense. So you can kind of reason it out like that. Like phosphoruside, that doesn't make any sense. Phosphoride, that kind of doesn't make any sense. I don't think you've heard of anything like phosphoride. Phosphide, you probably have heard of that. So at the end of the day, make sure it ends in "ide," and try to use common sense if you can when naming these monoatomic anions. And there isn't exactly a clear ending you can wipe off and replace with "ide." So this was naming monoatomic anions. Really isn't too bad. Get some practice. The polyatomic anions are kind of more painful. So probably make a future video on that. So stay tuned.